by the Middle East Peace Project, which is part of the Pikes Peak Justice and Peace Commission, sort of a subcommittee, active committee. We do various things. One of the main things we've done over the years is send someone, help finance someone to go to the Middle East and observe firsthand what's going on there in reference to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And so we have someone else. Chrissy Valet is here, and she's leaving in a few days to go do that. And then when she comes back, we hope to be able to sponsor some talks where she could talk about the experiences and what she learned over there firsthand. And then, like I said, we're sponsoring this event. We have Richard Ford from Boulder, and yes, and he's written a book which is Breakthrough: Transforming Fear into Compassion. And Rich, as I understand, used to actually work for AIPAC.
No, I was just a member.
A member?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. But you were
Thank God. I won't have that on my conscience.
a supporter of the AIPAC agenda, you might say. And then he did some more investigating and found out more information and sort of came to some different conclusions than he had in the first place. And so I think he's going to talk about that for us here. And I suppose this event was more or less running till 9 o'clock, and maybe we'll have time, some extended time for some questions and answers. I'm sure some people will maybe challenge the things you have to say, so we'll have that opportunity too. So thank you very much, Rich, for being here with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you, Steve and Jimmy and Lori and Scott, for having me on his radio show today. It was a very nice interview, punctuated by my being my internet connection just failing a couple times. But anyway, let me tell you a little, there's a couple things I want to mention. My book is back there. I'm selling it for $15, which is $5 off retail, and my business cards are over there, so feel free to take them. And I have more of everything. Also, I want to mention that I grew up in a Jewish family on the East Coast. My identical twin brother is an ultra-Orthodox, has been since 1971 or 72 when he was in Israel, when he was living in Israel. We were brought up Reform, but he became ultra-Orthodox, and he is to the right of pretty much any Israeli politician you can think of. And I have relatives living in an illegal settlement in the West Bank. Other relatives were living in Israel or served in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, but now they're back either in Canada or the United States. And my younger brother is a former president of one of the largest Reform synagogues on the East Coast. So, you know, with my background, you would think that I would probably be very pro-Israel, which I was. Okay. So I want to start the evening off with a metaphor that captures the essence of what I'll be talking about. If we use the image of a pitching mound to represent the conscious mind, we can use the image of Pikes Peak to represent the subconscious and unconscious mind. Much of what emerges in the world has its first stirrings from beneath the level of conscious awareness. From this vantage, many of the horrible things we see in the world can be seen as the enemy images of millions of unexamined and fear-based minds being projected out into the world of form. Imagination becoming reality, we could say. I'm going to try to deconstruct misconceptions and erroneous thinking that dominate the Israel-Palestine debate. I'll talk a bit about how my awakening to the suffering of the other relieved me of a lifetime of blind loyalty to Israel. Loyalty is admirable, but when it masks qualities such as fear, confusion, and prejudice, it can lead to horrible things. Another related fruit of awakening I'll share is how easily the unexamined mind can deceive us into creating a world of suffering for self and other. Up until the summer of 2006, I believed that the cause of the Israel-Palestine problem was the Arab world's non-acceptance of a Jewish state in its midst. And I believe this non-acceptance resulted from centuries of hatred of Jewish people, their religion, and culture. I also saw elements within the Christian world as still harboring the anti-Semitic attitudes that had produced centuries of pogroms in Eastern Europe and and the cruelest event in mankind's recorded history, the extermination of millions of Jews and millions of others because they were judged to be racially inferior. In July 2006, some of you may remember, Hezbollah killed 3 Israeli soldiers and abducted 2 in a cross-border raid into northern Israel, coming just 3 weeks after Hamas's capture of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit on the Israel-Gaza border. This hostility reinforced my fear that the Arab world would not rest until Israel was wiped from the face of the earth. I took both of these hostilities personally. Identified as a Jew, I could see myself in the place of these innocent Israeli soldiers. And there was no doubt in my mind that I was as much a target of terrorists as Shalit and the others. The day after Hezbollah's provocation, you may remember, Israel invaded Lebanon. Strongly supportive of the invasion, but also deeply troubled, I decided to talk to 2 of my closest and wisest friends, neither one Jewish, about the Arab world's genocidal intentions toward Jews. Now, I knew both of these friends had been critical of Israel in the past, but I wanted to convince them that this time I was correct in my assessment of the Arab world. So I knew they had been critical, and when I went to speak to them, I was certain that they would realize that my point of view really had always been correct. But to my utter amazement, both of them blamed Israel for its massive and disproportionate use of force against the people of Lebanon. I was completely shocked. They had virtually no sympathy for what I was trying to tell them. Afterwards, when I was alone, I carefully went over each conversation in my mind. I wanted to check to see if there was something I had missed or something I hadn't understood. Finding nothing, I solemnly concluded that only Jews can understand the suffering of our people. Of course, suffering is a universal phenomenon. A week passed, during which I attended a pro-Israel rally at the Jewish Community Center in Albuquerque, where I was living at the time, and spoke to Jewish friends whose like-minded views on the subject relieved me of some of my anxiety. Then I received an unexpected phone call. A few days later, I received an unexpected phone call from an old Jewish friend in New Jersey. My friend Sam was calling to tell me that he was coming out west and that he planned to visit me in New Mexico. After agreeing to the visit, I launched into a 2-hour diatribe against Israel's enemies. Now, Sam just listened. He barely said a word and he never argued. The interesting thing is that I knew Sam had studied the subject for many years, unlike me, but he was very, very low-key about it. Toward the end of my diatribe, he suggested I read books by 2 highly respected Jewish Israeli professors, neither of whom I had heard of, Baruch Kimmerling and Tanya Reinhardt. Because he didn't judge me or resist my point of view, he gave me the space to snap out of what I now recognize as a trance-like attachment to a belief system I had taken for granted for most of my life. Until that moment in 2006, it had never occurred to me that there was more to the Israel-Palestine story than I already knew, or that studying the subject could provide me with information I hadn't already considered. Imagine a world where, for example, where it never occurs to doctors of medicine that knowing something about anatomy and physiology could be useful. But that's the situation I was in. So after speaking to Sam, I went online to Amazon and looked up Kimmerling and Reinhardt. I also compiled a list of other books on the subject with the stipulation that I would only read Jewish authors, knowing that otherwise I would suspect bias. What I could not have foretold was that I was about to uncover a lifetime of bias within myself. I drove over to my local library and checked out a couple books. When I got home, knowing that my relationships both to Israel and to myself were about to be tested, I wanted to prepare myself emotionally, so I decided to wait a day before embarking on this project. The next morning was warm and bright. I sat down in my very comfortable easy chair and picked up a book, Beyond Chutzpah, on the Misuse of Anti-Semitism and the Abuse of History by Norman Finkelstein. With barely an idea of what I was getting myself into, I began reading. Thus began a conscientious study of the history of Israel-Palestine. My singular commitment was to the truth, and I knew that in order to separate fact from fiction, I was going to have to give equal attention to both sides of the debate, and I was not about to allow preconceived notions to influence my research. Finkelstein's documentation was meticulous, and many of the sources he cited were mainstream organizations, such as Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Group. As much as I would have liked to, I could not dismiss the findings of these human rights groups, and their findings were a very serious indictment of Israeli behavior and policy. Documented charges included the use of deadly force against civilians, men, women, and children, even when there was no threat posed from the other side. The demolition of houses, even with inhabitants still inside the houses. The use of collective punishment against large numbers of Palestinians on the basis of alleged crimes by lone individuals. The commonplace use of torture, and Israel standing as the only country in the world that legalized torture and political liquidation, and the theft of desperately needed water from Palestinian villages. Many of the reports Finkelstein cited could be found on the internet, so I spent a good deal of time reviewing passages he had quoted online. I was secretly hoping to catch him taking information out of context or changing a word here or there in order to present Israel in a negative light. And after reviewing everything I could, I had to admit that with regard to his sources, there was not a single instance that I could cite. Everything was beyond reproach. At the same time I was engrossed in Finkelstein's expose of Israel, internally I was experiencing a range of emotions. As I read about the abuse and humiliation that the Palestinians were routinely subjected to, I felt shocked that a country in which I had invested my loyalty would treat people this way. My shock turned to anger that Israel was perpetrating these abuses in my name as a Jew. I felt personally responsible, no less so than if I was a soldier in the field. My anger then turned inward, chastising me for years of willful blindness. Shame and embarrassment followed, and then immense sorrow for a people whose cries I had been deaf to. These human beings were suffering profoundly from my ignorance, and it became clear to me that the one crime every Palestinian is guilty of, from birth to death, is the crime of not being Jewish. I was in the initial stages of discovering that every argument I had ever made or heard in defense of Israel was either factually inaccurate, or if there was truth to the argument, taken out of context in order to blame the Palestinians and vindicate the Israelis. Feeling tired and wanting a respite from this repudiation of everything I had believed, I put the book down and closed my eyes. I have no idea how long my eyes were closed, but when I opened them, I felt cleansed and free. All of the emotions I'd been experiencing were gone. Their disappearance was so startling that I spontaneously began looking around the room, as if my emotions were physical objects that could hide in physical locations. Where was the anger, the shame, the shock? I scoured my bookcase, I looked in the corners of my room, but no sign of these emotions could be found. When it became obvious I was not going to find them, I sat back in my chair and relaxed into my newfound state of freedom and wonderment. I had no interest in the past and was not motivated toward the future. Not looking for one experience or avoiding another, I was perfectly neutral. I had nowhere to go and nothing to do. The present was all there is. I felt a light pressure, as if a soft cloth were covering my eyes. There was a soothing quality to the pressure. As I enjoyed the sensation, the cloth began to unravel from left to right in a spiral motion. When my eyes were uncovered, I realized that the world was brighter, and I realized that the world is a reflection of our inner states of consciousness. An inner peace pervaded my being. It was everything I could have wanted. It was the heart's desire. As I looked out, I saw that real peace must first be found within before it can be found without in the world. And because it is a reflection of us, the world is a psychophysical process. If we truly want to transform the world, we have to first transform ourselves. At a certain point in this process, the entire edifice of me could no longer withstand my inquiry into truth. and everything I was suffering collapsed. From a search for facts about Israel-Palestine, I had become involved in something greater, a physics that would not settle for just factual truth. When the physics reached a critical mass, it became about truth with a capital T. And through a remarkable purification, my sense of duality or separation disappeared, and the I had assumed myself to be was transformed. I then inquired into my Jewish identity, but could find neither a Jewish identity nor any other limited or exclusive identity. I tried to reanimate my Jewish identity, but was unable to. Next, I couldn't detect any fear of terrorists. My enemy images of these people seemed to have vanished. Given the terror I'd always felt whenever I heard of atrocities in Iraq or other parts of the world, I decided to test myself to see if these images were really gone. I imagined myself in the place of Nick Berg, the young Jewish man you may remember, who was beheaded in Iraq in 2004. Especially being a Jew, Berg's murder had horrified me, but the enemy images would not return. Instead, a feeling of equanimity arose, along with the knowledge that beneath their hatred, even the most bloodthirsty of extremists crave the same right to self-determination as do I. No longer able to deny the humanity of the other, I had reclaimed my own humanity. Without a limited or exclusive identity to define myself, I realized I was as much Palestinian as Israeli, as much Muslim or Christian as Jew. Compassion replaced fear, and clarity replaced confusion. Compassion is the ability to stand in the shoes of the other and see from all perspectives. Therefore, along with compassion, clarity arises. Compassion and clarity, seeking to understand all behavior, ask why the other behaves as he does. What are the stimuli for his behavior? Have we in some way provoked his behavior? Compassion and clarity understand that no behavior occurs in a vacuum, and that each of us is responsible for suffering in the world, and each of us contributes to the collective mind of mankind. A principal reason it has been so difficult to solve the Israel-Palestine dilemma is that fundamentally we are not dealing with a political problem, as virtually everybody thinks we are, nor at the deepest level are we dealing with a religious, cultural, territorial, or humanitarian problem. What we are dealing with is a spiritual problem, a problem of identity and of the mind. This is how it was for me. I could never have understood the problem until I understood my own mind and my presumed limited and mortal identity. In my research into this problem, I quickly ran up against my presumed identity. My indoctrination into a lifetime of propaganda about myself and my so-called people. The confrontation was shocking. The painful feelings I discovered within myself were a wound, but the wound was necessary because it was the doorway to the end of existential fear and confusion. Our presumed identity is the root of fear and confusion. Whether I am a Jew, a Palestinian, a Christian, a Muslim, an American, whatever I may be, my identity and its associated beliefs and images are the lens through which I perceive the world. And in my case, having possessed a Jewish lens, I had assumed that a significant part of the world's population held anti-Semitic views. With such a dominating internal logic, I was bound to interpret the ideas and behavior of the other as predisposed to incite or ignore the suffering of my people. All of us are receptive to ideas and behavior that fit within the framework of our identity. Ideas and behavior that fall outside this framework, that originate from the other, are interpreted as possible threats. Fear arises. We look at the world through this filter of fear and unconsciously superimpose enemy images onto the other. We automatically reduce to objects all that we perceive as the enemy. Then we hide from, disable, or destroy these objects in order to restore apparent security into our lives. Many Jewish people, influenced by collective memory, equate Arabs with Nazis and other persecutors. A core belief among Jews, including myself at one time, is that Israel, the Jewish home, is a shelter from a violent world. This belief is an underlying aspect of Jewish identity. To maintain this identity, we are therefore compelled to justify Israeli policy as a necessary response toward an unremittingly violent people. Dualistic thinking such as this conceives of a world of us against them, good against evil. Our emotions, our attitudes towards others, how we interpret events, what we notice and what we don't notice will mirror our worldview, thereby strengthening and authenticating it. In short, we create the world we live in. This is how the unexamined mind projects its content onto the world. One example of dualistic thinking is victim identity. If we are indoctrinated into the belief that we are victims of an oppressive world, our unconscious minds will inevitably create conditions that confirm we are indeed victims. Then we can justify oppressive policies against our so-called victimizers. Dualistic thinking induces so many who profess peace to support war. It is why so many normally decent people who claim to believe in justice support indecency and injustice. It is why so many who speak of democracy suppress democracy, and why so many who adhere to the catchphrase that never again should the world turn its back on the persecution of an entire people turn their backs on the persecution of an entire people. Like me once, my Jewish friends and relatives who defend Israel are not conscious of their prejudices against Arabs. They think their ideas about Arabs are simply a reflection of what is happening in the world. The opposite is true. What is happening in the world is a reflection of their ideas, of the enemy images that inhabit their minds in the unconscious and subconscious. Imagine the confusion that exists within a mind that justifies oppression, yet claims it wants peace. This mind is so terrified of challenging its thought patterns that it cannot comprehend that when we oppress a people and deny them basic rights, they have legitimate reasons to resist. Instead, it labels the resistance terrorism and responds or acts accordingly. The dualistic fear-based mind is not just self-destructive and narcissistic, it is fascistic. Our internal logic, or way of interpreting the world, parallels our indoctrination. For example, when someone would tell me that Israeli soldiers had killed children, I automatically reacted with disbelief, if not outright denial. My logical mind explained what really must have happened, which is that children were killed because Arabs had embedded their soldiers within civilian populations. Children were not victims of Israeli bullets. They were victims of Arab terrorists who were so consumed with enemy images of Jews that they were willing to sacrifice their own people in order to demonize my people. The path to freedom from these enemy images is self-inquiry. Anyone who takes on the work of self-inquiry will eventually discover that our common humanity precedes exclusive identification with any group. One of the fruits of self-inquiry is the recognition that the real enemy, the primal enemy, is not someone or something outside of us. The real enemy is the unexamined mind that unconsciously projects its suffering onto the world and then blames the world for its suffering. We can end this cycle of denial, projection, blame, and rationalization by inquiring into our beliefs and images, and thereby coaxing the unconscious into consciousness. There are few limits to how far people will go to protect core identities. Look at how many people, rather than inquiring into their nationalistic or religious identities, are willing to send their children to war, to kill or be killed. At an unconscious level, their presumed identities are more precious than the lives of their own children. Because our attachment to core identities and fear for their demise obstructs our ability to see clearly, our intrinsic yearning for peace becomes muzzled by the ego identity's compulsion to be right. From the false perspective of identity or ego, being right is more important than peace. An example of this phenomenon is Israel supporters' frequent reference to the 1947 partition plan, UN Resolution 181. Morally compromised for failing to obtain the consent of the indigenous people, 181 gave 56% of British Mandate Palestine to the Jewish people, who own less than 7% of the land, and 43% to the Palestinians, with the remaining 1%, Jerusalem and Bethlehem, under the authority of the United Nations. The argument Israel supporters make is that Jewish acceptance and Palestinian rejection of partition proves that the Jewish side has always wanted peace and the Palestinian side has never wanted peace. Therefore, the Palestinians are to blame for this never-ending problem. One of the flaws in this argument, because of the compulsion to be right, this flaw, there are certain details that are overlooked, is, for example, a Jewish state based upon partition would have had an initial 49% Arab minority that would quickly have become a majority. It is utterly naive to believe that the Jewish side would have accepted such an outcome. And in fact, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's founding father, pledged to his political party that the borders established by 181 were not final. In other words, acceptance of 181 was not an act of peace. It was a tactical decision and a prelude to further expansion. We've all heard Jews and Christians proclaim that according to the Torah, God gave the land to the chosen people. Israel has never defined its borders. Its de facto borders adapt with the movement of Jewish settlers and the expansion of Jewish settlements in the West Bank. Jewish residents of the West Bank have all the rights of citizenship, while Palestinian residents have none. Furthermore, these rights are founded not upon the place of one's birth, but upon one's religious identity. Furthermore, Israel is a signatory to the Fourth Geneva Convention, which explicitly prohibits an occupying power from transferring parts of its own population to the territories it occupies. Apparently, God's promise to the Jewish people supersedes the Jewish people's promise to the international community. But shouldn't anyone for whom the Torah is so authoritative that it can be used to rationalize the dispossession of an entire people, be expected to honor the Torah's prohibitions against scheming, stealing, and breaking contracts? And what are the Jewish people chosen for? Are they in fact chosen to scheme, steal, and break contracts? Or are they chosen, as Jewish mysticism says, to bring blessing to the world and to rectify injustice? According to Jewish teachings, this is how the world is made into a dwelling place for the divine. I think it takes a lot of chutzpah to make this previous argument while reciting the mantra that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Try telling...
But why don't we try not to chuckle so much about anti-Israel rhetoric?
You can ask questions when we're done. When I'm done speaking.
Absolutely.
Okay. Try telling non-Jews any... I can't help laughing because some of this is so absurd, but it's tragic.
And
Okay.
I feel, I don't mean to be, I would
Let me
never...
finish.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Try telling non-Jews anywhere in Israel-Palestine that they live in a democracy. The real purpose of this declaration is to divert attention from Israel's anti-democratic policies by professing an alleged moral superiority, while ignoring, with regard to its treatment of non-Jews, Israel's moral inferiority. Any definition of Israel's political structure cannot magically disguise the inequality that is made possible by the very people who make this declaration. Of the many things that could be said about this, let me say that within Israel proper, 1,200 Jewish towns, but not a single Palestinian town has been established since 1948. And Israel is actively dispossessing tens of thousands of Bedouins and removing them from their homes within Israel proper. Virtually all of these Bedouins are Israeli citizens, and their villages predate the state of Israel, but they're not Jewish. Furthermore, there are over 50 laws within Israel proper that discriminate against non-Jews. If these arguments are meant to shield Israel from criticism and to deny the suffering it has caused, how can anyone who makes these arguments think that they are contributing to peace? Peace can only be achieved when we let go of our compulsion to be right and commit ourselves to the truth. It was only when I committed myself to the truth that I was even able to apprehend the astonishing reality that criticism of Israel was never a serious concern for me. Incredibly, I had never defended Israel, at least the Israel that actually exists. I had defended idealistic images of Israel that I had unconsciously projected or superimposed onto the real Israel that actually exists. These projections enabled me to deny or repress painful insights that I would have learned about Israel and about myself if only I had looked without the influence of an unexamined mind. Denial and projection go hand in hand. What I denied about Israel and about myself, I projected onto the other, who automatically and necessarily became my enemy. My reaction to criticism was motivated more by the fear of taking on the challenge that the criticism posed to my identity than by genuine disagreement. And for a split second, this challenge was a threat because it gave me an unwelcome glimpse into the prejudice that had induced me to deny the humanity of the other. And in order to avoid encountering my own lack of humanity, I judged Palestinian violence as a pathological expression of hatred, not the response of an oppressed people, a small minority of whom resort to violence as the only way they know to retain a measure of self-respect in the face of generations of violence inflicted upon them. Thus, the rationale I used to condone Israeli aggression was security, but stealing a people's land and replacing one population with another fosters paranoia, which in turn demands repression, or which demand and security. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. If defenders of Israel want peace as much as they want to be right, they must understand that for them, the real conflict is not Israel versus a hostile government or Israel versus the Palestinian people. The real conflict is the inability to integrate the hard-to-believe but inescapable awareness of Israel's treatment of non-Jews with unquestioned loyalty to the Jewish state. One consideration acknowledges Israel's dark side, the other denies the dark side exists. If these defenders want to distinguish the source of conflict and find peace, they need to inquire within. Accusations of anti-Semitism, often meant to silence criticism, are common tactics in the Israel-Palestine arena, as many of you know. Accusers, often seeing themselves as the real victims in this struggle, allege that virtually any criticism of Israel is motivated by anti-Semitism. It is true that a small and growing percentage of critics are anti-Semitic and would like to do to Israel what Israel does to the Palestinians. But most critics simply want Israel to comply with international law. They have no desire to harm Israelis. Their desire is to prevent Israelis from harming Palestinians. They advocate equal rights for all because they know that equal rights lead to peace. If criticism of deliberate violations of international law is anti-Semitic, what is turning one's back on the suffering of millions? To slur a person's character because they believe in equal rights for all people, not some people, or because they admit to behavior others deny, is moral blackmail, and it debases the Jewish people. Did David Ben-Gurion suddenly become an anti-Semite when he admitted that Israel had stolen the land from the Palestinians? Was Yitzhak Rabin guilty of anti-Semitism when he lamented that ruling over another people has corrupted us? Those who justify the oppression of Palestinians often assume that concern for Palestinian rights equals contempt for Jewish rights. The dualistic mind thinks this way. If you are pro-Palestinian, you must be anti-Israeli. What this mind is really saying is that if you are pro-Israeli, you have to be anti-Palestinian. If caring for Palestinians is anti-Semitic, then I guess all Palestinians are anti-Semites. After all, what Palestinian wouldn't speak out against the destruction of their entire culture, the torture of their family members and friends? Most accusations of anti-Semitism are projections. The actual bigotry resides in the minds of those who are afraid to ask why someone is critical of Israel. Indifferent to the suffering of an entire people, these accusers refuse to take responsibility for their feelings of fear, confusion, and anger, all of which are animated by unexamined beliefs and images within their own minds. Instead of doing honest research to refute or confirm the criticism, they scapegoat anyone who challenges their beliefs and images. Real anti-Semites incite anti-Semitism, and honestly, I don't know anyone who does that more effectively than the Israeli government and its supporters. And after inciting anti-Semitism, they complain that the world is anti-Semitic. Then they justify inhumane actions on the basis of a need for security against anti-Semitism. Rather than make peace, the Israeli government knowingly perpetuates conflict in order to fulfill an out-of-control ideology. Israeli Prime Ministers Ben-Gurion, Begin, Shamir, Sharon, Netanyahu, and the ruling Likud party platform have all held that Israel's eastern border extends to the Jordan River or beyond. I want to speak a little bit about Gaza. But first I have a question I want to ask you. You don't have to answer me. I already know the answer. It's more a rhetorical question, but I just want to put this in your consciousness. How many of you sleep with your shoes on? I was in Gaza in November 2012, from November 5th to November 11th, just as Operation Pillar of Cloud was getting started. And on November 8th, some of you may remember this, a young boy by the name of Hamid Abu Daka was killed playing soccer in front of his house in the village of Abasan Kabira. He was killed by stray Israeli gunfire. I found out while I was in Gaza that Israeli tanks and drones and helicopters were often heard and seen in the sky, but Israeli tanks and soldiers, in general, on average, entered Gaza 6 times a week. So on November 8th, this little boy, this 12-year-old boy, is killed playing soccer with his friends in front of his house. On November 9th, I attended his funeral along with the other members of my delegation. The family had asked us to come to the funeral because we were the first human rights delegation in Gaza in quite a long time, and the Palestinian Center for Human Rights was our sponsor. Plus, Craig and Cindy Corey were part of our delegation. Their daughter, Rachel Corey, 10 years earlier, had been killed standing in front of a house, had been run over by a bulldozer. So we attended the funeral, met Hamid's parents and his brother and his friends, and after the funeral we walked over to his house and saw exactly where he was shot. No one saw any soldier, it was stray gunfire, and I also found out that when Israeli tanks and soldiers enter Gaza, possibly for just usually actually for a very slight provocation, they start firing in all directions as a way of protecting their soldiers, I guess. So we saw exactly where the boy was shot, and right next to his house was a kindergarten. And fortunately, the day he was shot, the kindergarten was not, none of the kids were outside. After we visited the site where he was killed, we walked to the outskirts of the village. Now, Abasan Kabira is only about a kilometer and a half from the Israel-Gaza border, so it's less than a mile. When we walked to the outskirts of the village, there was a house that was being built. And so some of us walked up to the roof of the house, and we could look out and we could see the border, and we could see the trees, and we could see a couple tanks hovering behind the trees. As I walked down from the roof and walked out of the house and started walking towards the bus that was waiting for us 100 yards away or so, I'm walking through the fields. A woman a lot of the villagers had come out to greet us and to just see us. They were interested in us, and they also wanted to talk to us. So as I'm walking towards the bus, a middle-aged woman says to me, "Do you sleep with your shoes on?" And I found out that many people sleep with their shoes on. And the reason they sleep with their shoes on is because they can get out of bed quicker and run to wherever they can find something resembling shelter when Israel starts firing whatever they're firing. They fire a lot of rockets into Gaza. And in fact, one of the main arguments that people make is that, well, Israel's only defending itself against rocket attacks from Gaza. If they would do some research, they would find out that in most cases, the rocket fire is a result of Israel's deliberate provocation. Most of the ceasefires that have been established between Israel and, for example, Hamas or whatever wing of the Palestinians we're talking about, because this is over a period of a long time, almost all of the ceasefires, based on a study conducted by the University of Tel Aviv in conjunction with MIT and Harvard, almost all of the violations of ceasefires have been on Israel's part. And last summer's invasion of Gaza that killed over 2,100 people, including about 500 children, Israel deliberately baited Hamas until Hamas finally took the bait, and that was their excuse to go in. But to give you an example, according to the Israeli Terrorism and Information Center, between 2000 and the end of 2008, 9 years, Palestinian groups from Gaza launched a total of 8,088 rockets and mortars into Israel. In just 9 months, between the Gaza withdrawal of settlers, of Jewish settlers in September, the end of August, early September 2005, to the capture of Gilad Shalit in June of 2006, Israel fired almost 8,000 rockets into Gaza. And Israel's rockets are, I don't know, 1,000 times more powerful than the rockets that Gaza was firing. In fact, I was in Sderot, which is a village, an Israeli village, not far from Gaza, and they often get, when Palestinian groups launch rockets into Israel, some of the rockets land in Sderot. I saw the rockets, I stood by the holes. I think if a rocket landed maybe by you, I don't think I would get killed. I mean, it might throw up debris from the dirt, but it probably wouldn't kill me. But if an Israeli rocket landed there, everybody probably on this floor would be killed. So, you know, people just need to start looking at reality a little more. It's really important that people find out what's really going on before they make judgments. Let me see what time it is. Okay, I want to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. So, let me finish by saying that I've talked about how we create our own reality and how daunting it can be to confront our indoctrination. And my commitment to discover the facts is what led me to overcome my indoctrination. And that same commitment is available to everyone. In fact, I don't want you to believe anything I don't want you to believe outright anything I've said today. Do your own research and find out the facts for yourself. And if you do, I'm sure you will discover some of the deeper things I've talked about today. For the record, I am not pro-Palestinian, nor am I anti-Israeli. I am pro-equality and anti-oppression. And that is why I criticize Israel and advocate an end to its anti-democratic policies. If the roles of Palestinians and Israelis were reversed, I would be doing pretty much the same thing as I'm doing now. I want to read a few words from my book. Quote, "As long as we see the world in terms of us against them, we will have no choice but to identify ourselves as victims or aggressors in the constant stress of battle, disconnected from our hearts, living in fear. There can be no present, only the agonizing past, as if calamity and misfortune are realities in every moment. In that traumatized vision, we must be prepared to unleash our own Holocaust upon others so that it can never again be unleashed upon us. To go beyond thousands of years of conditioning and erroneous thinking is not easy, yet that is what everyone must do if they want to alleviate the horrendous suffering we see throughout the world. If we want a more peaceful world, we have to create that world ourselves. We can't abandon that responsibility and expect anyone else to do that work for us. Transform ourselves and we transform the world. Find peace within and we'll find it without. Commit ourselves to the truth and we will discover our common humanity with all people. Then we can help others to understand that the collective pain of the Jewish people that lies at the heart of this problem can only be resolved when the collective pain of the Palestinian people is healed. All of us want security, but the truth is there is no security except the commitment to truth itself. That commitment is the doorway to the end of fear and confusion. Thank you. I guess we're going to have a question and answer period. I know that young lady has a question.
How lovely to be called young. Wait, let me just... I want to tell you, first of all, in my whole life, I've never interrupted a speaker. So it's just a sign of just, this is, for me, as a Jewish Zionist humanist, I am personally invested. I am somebody who is a humanist and has not rejected being Jewish. I like, awesome.
I
You
just wanted to say
spoke
this
on
to make
behalf
sure
of
you
the
weren't
Jewish.
misunderstanding me.
Okay, but if I want to just go based upon your words. You have had a journey of discovery, and I honor that. I honor that deeply. I can only speak for myself. I would never be so presumptuous as to speak at a table full of wonderful, warm, open hearts and proclaim to speak on behalf of all my people in any way. I can only speak for myself.
Is that a question or a criticism?
I'm going to make my little statement. Is that all right?
Well,
Is that all right?
I
Is that
prefer-
inappropriate?
This is a question and answer period. You know, I mean, if you have a question, ask the question. I think you're saying that I was speaking on behalf of all Jews, which I wasn't.
I'm so sorry, I can't speak so coherently.
Maybe you disagree with something he said, you can identify.
Yeah, I'd rather you ask the question, because I'm not sure what you're saying.
I think I only would say that many of us who are the proud parents of young Jewish people who grew up in Israel, who are very critical of governmental choices, who mourn the loss of children, who do not have any denial, and we are not in the minority, by the way. Many of us do not feel that demonizing Israel is the path to peace.
Okay, I got to stop you here. Is someone demonizing Israel?
I said demonize.
Is someone demonizing Israel?
Sir,
I'm
I'm
asking
only
you,
going...
would you please ask your question? I mean, I don't think it's
I
appropriate
don't
for you to
think
give
I
a
have
speech.
the appropriate...
You're talking about demonizing Israel. What is your question? Are you suggesting that I demonized Israel? Are you suggesting that I was speaking on behalf of all Jews? What is your question?
I have no question.
Okay.
I thank you so
Well, let me
much.
just say, first of all, 95% of the Israeli public supported Israel's invasion of Gaza last summer. And had they studied, actually paid attention to what was going on and read more than just some of the Netanyahu-based newspapers, the most popular newspaper in Israel is a Sheldon Adelson newspaper, which is free, and it's the most widely read newspaper. It's basically a campaign statement for Benjamin Netanyahu. But had they studied what was really going on, they would have seen that, well, actually, I can give you the exact details. In April of 2014, a year ago, Fatah and Hamas agreed to form a unity government. Hamas agreed to this because they were so weak. In June of that same year, June last year, that unity government was made official, and Hamas agreed to virtually all of Fatah's demands. Some of you may know this already, but I'm going to go over this. They handed over responsibility. Hamas handed over the responsibility for governing Gaza to Fatah, to Mahmoud Abbas, the most compliant Palestinian leader in the history of Israel-Palestine relationships. Not a single Hamas member was part of the new government. Hamas even subordinated itself to the Palestinian Authority and agreed to the presence of Palestinian Authority security forces in Gaza, including at borders and crossings. Thank you. Critically, the unity government, and this is really important, the unity government said it would comply with the 3 conditions for Western aid demanded by the United States and its European allies. Nonviolence, which Israel has never renounced. In fact, Israel, if you look at the roadmap to peace that was signed under George W. Bush, the Palestinians accepted it. Israel accepted it with 14 caveats and prerequisites, including that the roadmap cannot prevent Israel from inciting violence and using violence against the Palestinians. Okay, so the 3 conditions demanded by the United States and its allies: the renunciation of violence, which Israel has never renounced, adherence to past agreements, something Israel has rarely honored, and recognition of Israel, even though Israel has never recognized the Palestinian state, other than 2009 when Netanyahu made his speech at Bar Ilan University and said he was recognizing a Palestinian state, which, as we know, this past election a month ago, he took that back, but he never meant it in the first place. It was simply to pacify the United States. Anyway, once this unity government was formed, it enraged Netanyahu because it took away one of the main reasons why one of the main excuses Israel had for not being able to make peace with the Palestinians, which is, one of the reasons Israel gives is that it's a divided people. There's Hamas and there's Fatah and they're split. How can we deal with just one element of the Palestinian people? Oh, but we're not going to deal with Hamas because they're terrorists. And so, so Mahmoud Abbas made it clear that the unity government was going to operate under his control and follow his lead, which I would have thought, and most people, I think, would have thought that a unity government controlled by Fatah, with Hamas being in the background, would have been cause for celebration in Israel. However, had they studied the history, they would have known that it wouldn't have been cause for celebration, and it wasn't. So Netanyahu was looking for a pretext. I mean, this is all documented. And what happened was in June, as you may remember, 3 Jewish settler teenagers were kidnapped and killed. Now, Netanyahu knew within 24 hours that these teenagers were dead, but he put a gag order on the security forces and the press. He didn't even tell the parents that they were dead. I think it was, well, I'll get to that. I think it was about 2 weeks before it was announced that they were dead.
How do you know he knew?
That it was in the Israeli newspapers.
That they were dead right away?
No, it was in the Israeli newspapers that he knew that they were dead. Okay, so so after imposing a gag order within 24 hours, a gag order on the press and security forces, Netanyahu sent Israeli security forces into the West Bank to arrest hundreds of Hamas members, and they never interrogated these members as to whether or not they knew anything about the kidnapping. And the Israeli forces destroyed hundreds of homes and killed 11 Palestinians. On July 1st, so this was 2 weeks after Netanyahu sent his forces into the West Bank. On July 1st, the bodies of the teenagers were found. Israel reacted to this news by launching 34 airstrikes on Gaza. And then on July 7th, Israel murdered 5 Hamas members. And this was the final straw for Hamas, which had honored the truce and had not launched any rockets for 19 months. And so Hamas launched some of its rockets, and the following day, Operation Protective Edge began. And Hamas is now stronger. So this is kind of how it works. I mean, Moshe Dayan, who is one of Israel's great heroes, and a former chief of staff and defense minister, Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who is the longest-serving General Yehoshaphat Harkabi, who is the longest-serving general of Israeli military intelligence, both made clear how Israel baits the opposition, how that Israel is committed to baiting, whether it's the Syrians or now Hamas. They make sure they bait them and keep building up the pressure and keep building up the pressure until the other side can't stand any longer and reacts. And then Israel uses that as an excuse to then go in and do whatever it feels it has to do. Regarding this young woman, I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I just thought I didn't want her to give a speech because this is not the venue for her to give a speech. And I wanted her to be more clear and ask me directly or make a criticism of me directly instead of saying something that I couldn't tell whether it was directed towards me or not. The fact is that if 95% of the Israeli public supports this kind of devastation, and it's because they're in denial, unlike contrary to what she was saying. Because if you read the history, you know that Israel is going to attack Palestinians very often, that it's a common tactic. In fact, Israel has made it clear, generals, chiefs of staff, that their premier military strategists have all admitted, David Ben-Gurion has admitted, that Israel has always deliberately and consciously, premeditatively targeted civilians. There's no question about it. And Israel used to be proud of that fact. In fact, when the archives were opened in the 1980s, and Benny Morris was one of the first Israeli historians to come out with his books, he came out with The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem and Righteous Victims. Some of these authors, I'm using Benny Morris in particular because he's one of the most prominent, he didn't realize that when he was exposing all of the massacres that Israel conducted in 1947, 1948, and the deliberate killing of civilians, he thought that people would simply be proud of that because they were acting like other countries in the history of the world have acted. He didn't know there would be a backlash because Benny Morris is an extreme Zionist. He believes that all Palestinians, well maybe not all Palestinians, but he believes that Palestinians are psychotic and should be locked in cages. And that David Ben-Gurion didn't go far enough in 1948 because he only expelled 750 Palestinians when he should have expelled all of them. That's where Benny Morris stands, yet he was one of the main historians, and I give him credit for being honest, for revealing a lot of the atrocities that have taken place. So, question?
First I want to say, I admire your search for your truth and the complexity of this situation. Can there ever be peace? In your opinion, can there ever be peace? And what would be required? I mean, I hear the whole thing in terms of the transformation of Israel.
Well, the transformation of all of us.
That's right. So, if it could be attained, in your opinion, what would it take? Total transformation of the
No,
entire
well, I don't
world?
think a total transformation is going to happen for thousands of years, but I think the United States is the key, and in particular the United States Jewish community, because they have the most influence. I think the evangelical Christian community that believes, even the dispensationalists who believe that the West Bank must be populated by Jews only so that the Second Coming can happen, I think they take their cue from the Jewish community. So the United States, and the United States government takes its cue from the Jewish community. I mean, AIPAC has tremendous influence over Congress. In fact, a lot of, Fritz Hollings, who was the he's the retired senator from, I think, North Carolina. When he retired, I wish he had said it earlier, but when he retired, he said, let me tell you something. The only reason we invaded Iraq is because AIPAC wanted us to. Every senator knows it, and we would not have invaded Iraq if not for AIPAC. But the United States policy has to honor its own commitment to its democratic values. It cannot. The United States cannot keep saying that it's a country that honors freedom and democracy, and then enabling another country, to suppress freedom and democracy. The United States is the key, because Israel cannot get away with what it's doing if not for the United States. And the United States, if it abided by its own laws, such as the arms export law with the Symington Amendment, the United States is violating its own laws by giving Israel military equipment, because it is against the law, number one, for a nuclear-armed country that is not a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to receive armaments from the United States. And number two, it is against the law for the United States to give weapons to any country that uses them to suppress democracy and to suppress and oppress civilians. So maybe one day, and I personally, a lot of people say, well, there's no chance for a two-state solution, and I pretty much agree with that, and that was the design all along with the way the settlements were built, where they were built. But Israel certainly didn't make a two-state solution impossible in order to have a single state. That's obvious. So as a lot of Israeli analysts are saying, Israel's going to have a choice, either a single apartheid state, like South Africa, or a single democratic state, which means that Israel, that it would not have a Jewish majority eventually, actually very quickly. So I'm not optimistic. The only chance I see is the United States coming to a senses. I think that the Israel-Palestine issue is the linchpin of a lot of what is going on in the Middle East. Israeli analysts, I heard Ami Ayalon speak in person. He's the former head of the Israeli Navy and one of the heads of Shin Bet, and he specifically stated that if you want to make peace with Iran, Israel has to make peace with the Palestinians. That Israel making peace with the Palestinians is a key to bringing Iran back into the into the community of nations and alleviating that problem that apparently we have with Iran. And I don't think it's as bad as people say it is, but Iran is a little bit fakakt, to use the Yiddish saying. Yes.
You've mentioned fear several times, and it is a massive motivator. I totally agree with you on that. And also looking at the United States as being a key to the peace, if it's ever going to happen. But here in the United States, we're also dealing with fear. We're being manipulated, and just as the Israelis are being manipulated with fear.
Right.
I'm not sure how we buy out of that, how we change that culture.
Well, is that your question? It's a very good question. Well, what I'm saying is find out the facts for ourselves. Really, the reason I said I don't want you to believe outright anything I've said is because if people simply, now, and I know most of you, you're a much more aware audience than the average American audience. Let's, I hope I'm not, being too derogatory, but just look at Fox News, just look at what some of these crazy senators say. But, I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, so,
Fox will do that too.
so, if you believe what I say, what will happen if someone more charismatic and more persuasive comes along and says the opposite thing? Maybe you'll believe what they say, and you'll never really know what's going on. But if you find out for yourself, if you do your own research, well, then you'll be much more grounded in reality. And once I've done voluminous research. I mean, you wouldn't believe how much research I did. The Finkelstein book was just the first or second book I read. But I've studied this subject every day since July of 2006, every day. And I've been to Gaza, I've been to the West Bank, I've spent a lot of time. After a while, and actually it didn't take that long, it only took probably me reading, I don't know, maybe a couple months worth of books, maybe 5 books. I was able to understand what Israel was going to do. I understood the mentality. I was in the West Bank actually in 2010 when Israel attacked the Mavi Marmara, which was the part of the Gaza flotilla, remember that? And they killed 10 people. I was in Israel at the time, and before they attacked the Mavi Marmara, I told people they're going to kill people. They're going to deliberately kill people because that's what they do. And it was because I had studied the subject so much, and also having gone into my own unconscious mind, I really understood, I think I really did understood the reasoning, and it is based on fear. It really is based on fear and indoctrination. And most people are decent. Okay? There are always going to be people who don't care. Most people that I know who defend Israel, they don't believe in oppression. They don't believe in injustice. They just think Israel's defending themselves. Now, Israel's leaders, it's hard for me to believe that Netanyahu doesn't know what's really going on. After all, given who his father was a historian who was secretary to Vladimir Jabotinsky, the founder of the Irgun, the Jewish terrorist organization, who was much more, and Jabotinsky was much more mild, I believe, than Netanyahu is. But, Netanyahu, I believe, all his life has dreamed of being the savior for Israel. His friends even calling him say that he has a messianic complex. They think it's a good thing. I think it's a Pied Piper type of thing. But all his life, I believe he has dreamed of fulfilling the Zionist dream, which is taking the entire land for Israel. He wants it all. He wants the entire West Bank. So, in answer, I guess I've answered your question and answered a lot more questions than maybe someone might ask. Thanks. Yes, sir.
How do we attack the embedded, I don't know if bias is the right term, embedded bureaucracy of the U.S. in terms of the CIA and the State Department and their support of the current, which is not related to the Israeli-Palestinian, but the current support of the Saudis attacking Yemen, for example?
I think it all comes down to educating ourselves. We need our schools. Well, let me give you an example. This is a little off the subject, but a friend of mine is an educator, and she has spent her life actually educating other educators. She's gone all over the world teaching people how to instill, teaching other educators how to instill in critical thinking and self-respect within kids. And she told me that she's been everywhere. She's been to the North Pole. She's been to the, South America. The only place she's not welcome is Middle America. They tell her, really, what they tell her is, we don't want our kids thinking for themselves. We want them to believe what we want them to believe. We want them to believe our thoughts. So as long as people don't think critically and they stay attached to their indoctrination, there's not really much hope. That's how politicians are able to manipulate us. And actually the politicians are manipulated themselves. Many of these politicians, they have these really false beliefs. I heard Tom Cotton being interviewed. I only caught the end of his interview on National Public Radio after the letter was sent to Iran, signed by 47 senators, and I heard him say, they can all burn in hell.
Oh.
And I mean,
He means it.
What's that?
He means it.
Of course he means it. So he doesn't see Iranians as human beings. He has the point of view that many American presidents have had, and many politicians on both sides of the aisle have, which is American exceptionalism. If you're an American, you're superior to other people. That automatically eliminates the ability to discover our common humanity with all people, and the ability to really empathize with people. I was telling Lori, I think it was Lori earlier, maybe it was Steve, how in the United States never apologizes for any action. The United States never takes responsibility for what they've done. When Obama spoke even about Christianity, about the Crusades, he said something like, well, it's not just Islam that has had extremism in it. What about the Crusades? Look at some of the horrible things that happened there. There was a huge outcry. He was slammed. It was unbelievable. So there are no solid answers to any of these questions. It really depends on each of us. We can only be responsible for ourselves. And that responsible means thinking critically and trying to see things from all points of view and separating fact from fiction. Yes, in the back.
Do you see any cracks developing in AIPAC, and are you involved in trying to create some?
Well, I'm always involved in creating cracks, and I try to create cracks by speaking. I mean, occasionally I'll get some Zionists to my talk who actually thank me afterwards and tell me that I opened their eyes. Unfortunately, the woman here, I think she was too... My guess is that she couldn't face the fact that she was supporting a oppressive regime. She was living in a world where most of my relatives and friends think that way. They think that they are, as I said in my speech, they think that they're not prejudiced. They think that the problem is that the Palestinians in the Arab world hates the Jews. That's what they think is going on, and they won't read a book. I have asked many Jewish friends in the last 9 years, I've said to them, why don't you read a book? Just one book. No one has to know you're reading the book. I'm serious. You can read the book in the comfort of your own house. You can put it down anytime you want. You don't have to believe a word you read. Just try reading a book, because you have strong opinions on this. This is a very core issue in our world today. I have not found one person who's been willing to read a book. Even some of my closest friends. They wouldn't even read my book. And they know me, they know that they would tell you that they could usually rely on me and that I was an honest person, yet they don't want to read my book. It's fear. They don't want to discover their own lack of humanity. I'm not saying they're inhumane people, but like me, I didn't know that I was dehumanizing the other. I thought, well, they're maniacs. I'm just being realistic. They're maniacs. But no, they weren't maniacs. They were human beings like me. Yes, sir. Doctor.
Well, I was just picking up on what you were saying. First of all, I appreciate your insights and the journey that you've taken in sharing it. I thought it was very well presented. Excellent points. Probably the best I've heard along these lines ever. But taking that point of the bigger picture of trying, when will peace come in the Middle East, and when people have understood these biases and other perspectives that need to be revised as a nation, in Israel is one of those first steps. And I noticed from the very beginning introduction, which you just alluded to, that even in your own family, it's hard to even start in the microcosm of your own loved ones to convince them. and we think of the task of a whole nation or the people, Jewish and Christian and worldwide, that have these types of views that could very much benefit from a more careful examination. So it just points out the challenge that we face.
Yeah, it is the challenge. In fact, it is what all the religions and all the spiritual teachings have really devoted themselves to, because it's about recognizing, all of these teachings are about recognizing that we're much more than who we think we are. We're not just this one solid identity. And it's all about going beyond a separative identity to finding our common humanity with all people, our non-separate common humanity with all people. That is why this is the hardest challenge. I consider this the hardest thing anyone can do. So, thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Your statement. Anybody else?
Can I pass this email list around? If you're interested in finding out about other upcoming events that Matt does,
Yeah.
Middle East Peace Project, you can just put down your email.
And also, one second, see, also anyone, I have my business cards over there, I have more of them, I may not have put enough out there. But take a business card if you want to get on my email list. I don't send very many emails out at all, but if you get on the list, you'll know when I'm speaking again, or if I publish an article, which I don't do that often anymore, but every couple months or 3 months I might publish something. And maybe I'll do another book, I'm not sure. Steve.
Lenny, because Bill asked you about cracks in APAC.
Oh, I didn't answer
And you
that.
didn't answer so
Sorry,
much,
Bill.
and you might have a better perspective than a lot of us of what you think may be going on there in J Street and all of that.
APAC, it's really interesting. APAC, it's the money. And if you have a billionaire like Sheldon Adelson, for example, who can pour hundreds of millions of dollars into something if he wants, that money buys tremendous influence. So it's not that APAC has so many members. The majority of Jewish people under the age of 35 in this country do not support what Israel is doing. And it's growing, but they don't have the money. And so the money controls what the United States politicians do. Those guys, you may have all heard how the Adelson had not all, but a bunch of the Republican candidates for president, they had to pledge fealty to him. And when Chris Christie referred to the West Bank as occupied territory, oh my God, he had to retract and say it's disputed territory. I mean, that's the same mistake Ariel Sharon made. And his lawyer said, no, you can't call it occupied territory, it's disputed territory. And so he said, oh, okay. Sharon said that, But he knew it was occupied. So, cracks in APAC. I don't know if there are cracks in APAC. I think they have so much money that they're so sophisticated that they're able to continue to find other ways to make sure that Congress, to make sure that Congress and the President of the United States does their bidding, or at least doesn't give them much trouble. That's what's going on. Any other questions? Yes?
There's a lot of money to be made by building weapons, destruction.
Right, that too.
50% of America's economy depends on war right now.
Right.
So I'm wondering, I would imagine there's probably a lot of people, maybe Jewish people, who are involved in the weapons industry. There's got to be some kind of, like you said, monetary profit as well as, preserving their identity and their land.
Right.
Too.
Well, the big corporations, the defense corporations, do spend a lot of money, with politicians gaining influence. And I have read, I never say it in my speeches, but I have read many times that, and I've heard it from Palestinians, and I've heard it from Israelis, and I've read it in mainstream newspapers, that often when Israel invades Gaza, they're testing weapons, and then they sell those weapons to China. And I don't know if you know this, but there's been more spies for Israel than for any other country, and a lot of the spies, Jonathan Pollard is still in prison because his spying led to the deaths of a number of American, I guess CIA members. But a lot of the spies for Israel get away with their spying. They get away with stealing technology, and the United States doesn't imprison them. And apparently Israel then uses a lot of the information and sells it to China, and other countries. But China, of course, is the big, might be a big threat to the United States. So, any other questions? Yes?
I liked what you said about not being pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli and kind of putting it in a peace and justice
Right.
focus, and, because I've used that myself too, to say I'm not, I'm pro-peace and justice for,
Right.
for both people, but do you have any advice on how we can deal with some of these Zionist people that are so disruptive, like when you try to do events, like, was it last summer, Jimmy, or the summer before? When they were bombing Gaza.
Oh, Finkelstein.
And
Yeah,
we,
Finkelstein here, and yeah, we had a
we
candlelight
were
vigil.
trying to, do rallies to kind of raise awareness about what's happening in Gaza, what the death toll was, what, the situation there, and we were being picketed by, people from the synagogue, and, you don't want to stop doing that stuff because, there's a need to, but, I don't know, I just didn't know how to deal with it. At one point, they came and stood with us in the circle, and they had their Israeli flags. I was standing next to this guy with an Israeli flag, and I'm like, I'm not going to stay here. That's not why I'm here. I'm not here because I'm a supporter of Israel.
They don't want to hear it because it challenges their identity. It's a mortal threat, That's why I mentioned that people are more willing to send their own children to war to kill or be killed than to inquire into their religious or nationalistic identities. I don't know what to tell you. What you're describing is the same situation I have with family members, other Jewish people who see the suffering of the Palestinians have. It's very hard to get people to open their eyes. As I said a few minutes ago, it is the hardest thing. It is the hardest thing because to open their eyes, they have to encounter their own indoctrination, which they don't see as indoctrination.
Right.
They see as who they are.
I understand that, but I just don't want to have our events broken up.
Right.
I mean, I think
No.
that's the purpose, is to kind of get us to
Because
stop doing,
What's your name?
Cindy.
Cindy, because of First Amendment rights, they just allowed, a judge just ruled, I'm not sure I agree or disagree with his ruling, but a judge just ruled in New York City. Did anyone see those subway ads that Pamela Geller's group put up?
Oh, I heard
She was
about this.
She was one of the instigators of the
Real extreme.
movement against the mosque that was being built near Ground Zero from 9/11. She's a real hater of Muslims and Arabs. And the ad, some of the ads said things like, Allah, we should kill all Jews, or something like that. And I think it was the Metro Authority in New York City took them to court. They said, because they told the court, this is going to instigate violence. We don't want these on our subway cars. And the judge ruled it's a First Amendment right. So, so fortunately, there were other groups that maybe not as rich as Pamela Geller's that countered with other signs that were funny. I can't remember some of the things, but there's a group that talks about Muslims, and it makes some jokes and stuff, and it was, trying to bring some levity to the situation, Any other questions from anybody?
Kind of
Yes.
trying to formulate the question. It's like if we accept that Arab hostility towards Israel's response to the misdeeds or whatever blanket term you want to use for things that Israel is doing wrong, why would the Nazis have been hostile towards Jews? Were there misdeeds also?
No, I'm not, no, what I'm saying,
Okay, so is it more like you were talking about the Pikes Peak of the fear, and do you have a word that I could use for that whole package of stuff that you described about how we've got this subconscious thing that motivates us and
well,
makes-
identity,
okay, so
self and other,
So-
which becomes us against them.
so could it be like Nazi hostility towards Jews was part of that identity thing, the fear thing?
Well, that's the Arab, I'm not saying, some of the, Saudi Arabia and Israel actually kind of cooperate with each other.
I suspect.
Now, I'm sure that Saudi Arabians cooperate with Israel the way that some evangelical Christians cooperate with Israel. They really don't like Jews, but it's to their mutual advantage, right?
Like Iranians.
Yeah, but the Nazis, the Holocaust, this is what's so interesting. The Holocaust probably would not have happened if not for Christianity, because Christianity decreed in like the 3rd or 4th century, I can't remember what it was, that the Jews had killed Christ. Now, it wasn't until the 60s that Pope John, I think the 23rd. I think it was Pope John the 23rd, who then apologized and said, no, the Vatican retracts that statement. But I believe that just that statement, let me give you an example for me. And I said this on Scott's radio show earlier today. I grew up hearing that Nasser was the Hitler of the Middle East. For those of you too young to know who Nasser was, he was the leader of Egypt from the early 50s until he died in 71, I think it was, and Sadat took his place. And Nasser was the most charismatic leader of the Arab world. And he tried many times to speak with David Ben-Gurion, and he said that if he had a few hours with Ben-Gurion, they could make peace. And he sent Maltese emissaries and British emissaries and Yugoslavian emissaries. And Ben-Gurion would meet nobody. And all Ben-Gurion would do was he labeled Nasser the Hitler of the Middle East. Now, I was a kid when this was going on. This was in the 50s. I was born in 1948. I heard the phrase that Nasser was the Hitler of the Middle East. I heard it in synagogue during, during socializing events. From the adult men would talk about Nasser being the Hitler of the Middle East. I didn't know that that phrase came from Ben-Gurion. Not that it mattered.